Okay, I think we'll get started. So, bon matin, tout le monde. Good morning. I hope you're all well on this sunny morning here in Bray, where I am based at the moment. You're welcome. Welcome to all our members and our guests on behalf of the France Ireland Chamber of Commerce and our partner for this webinar, Sigmar Recruitment. As restrictions lift, and we're very glad to see this happening, and choice of workplace emerges, how we lead our distributed workforce needs to be geared differently to ensure equity amongst our workforce. So we are delighted you can join us today for this conversation on the emerging thinking and practices to ensure high-touch leadership in a low-touch economy. So I think it's a topic extremely timely, and we're very happy to be able to bring this conversation to you today. Before I move on to a panel of speakers, just to remind you that at the bottom of your screen, you'll find a chat button. We will have a Q&A about 10 minutes at the end of this session today. So you're very welcome to put your questions in on the chat button, and we will do our best to answer them during the hour that we have. Moving on to a panel of speakers, I'll start with Robert Phádraig, who is founder of Talent Summit and CEO of Sigmar Recruitment. And he's widely recognized as a global talent influencer. Robert co-led the MBO of Sigmar Recruitment and its subsequent growth before its strategic merger with Group Adequate in 2018. And I'd like to add that Group Adequate, due to the fantastic work by Sigmar here in Ireland, won the Best French Company in Ireland award last year in 2020. So congratulations on that, Robert, and all the team. And moving to our second speaker today is Aine Murray. And Aine is Head of Marketing, Communications, Corporate Responsibility and Bid Support at Veolia for Ireland and Northern Ireland. And she is also a member of the leadership team. And Aine is very familiar to us because she has had many roles on the council and executive team of the France Ireland Chamber of Commerce for over 10 years. And I'm very pleased to announce also that Aine has recently been appointed Vice President of the Chamber. So you're very welcome, Aine, as well. And moving on to our moderator today, who is Michelle Fogarty. And Michelle is co-founder and COO of the award-winning workplace culture and wellbeing action platform, Peptalk. She is also a former international athlete and had 20 years experience leading top-tier organizations from a human capital perspective. And she is also a founding board member of SERI, which is the National Social Enterprise Representative Body of Ireland. So what I'll do now is pass you over to Michelle as moderator, who is going to begin the conversation today with Aine and Robert. Over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, thanks everybody, and thanks for joining us. And I know it's 10 o'clock on a Thursday. It's in Dublin anyway. It's kind of dull and grey outside, but it's a big topic. No, Rob is looking at his window in South Dublin, no doubt, and it's looking glorious. But it's a big topic to cover this morning. So myself and the panel, I suppose we just want to hit what we think are the high points of this, but we recognize that it's a big topic. We're not going to do it complete justice in the hour. So rough kind of approach, Cliona, is we'll take about 40 to 45 minutes to chat through what we think are maybe the big pertinent questions. And then we'll leave time at the bottom of the hour then for a Q&A. So any questions that you have, maybe even if you think of them during the session, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can pull them back up at the end. And then we'd like to kind of culminate it into some takeaways, some very practical takeaways. So everything we chat about today will be super practical. So just, I suppose, a little bit of the backdrop to where we're at. I mean, obviously we've all been through the last year, so I don't need to recap on what COVID's been like for everyone. But I suppose a little bit from a research perspective and to put ourselves into the position of where employees, and particularly our employees, are at. I was interested to look that Gallup did some research just literally in the month before last gone out. And what the research is saying is that 59% of employees would like to keep working remotely in some fashion or as much as possible, even post-pandemic. So what that's saying to us is that yeah, okay, we know we haven't really been truly working remotely. We've been working remotely in the middle of a pandemic, which is not the same thing. But what the research seems to be telling us is that people have, I suppose, taken the elements that they like, or they're aware of new elements that they like in working remotely, or what it might mean for them and how they work. And they're very interested in that. And then there was also another survey done by Glassdoor, which most people will be familiar with. It's kind of like an employer rating site. And only 5% of the employees in that survey said that they wanted things to go back exactly the way that they were before. So I suppose what I would take from that is that, you know, whether, and you may not even know yet where your company's going, but whether you're going back to the office, whether you're going to do some hybrid situation in the middle of a mixture between remote and office, or whether you're going to go fully remote or anything on that spectrum, I guess what is interesting this morning is there's probably something for everyone to take away, because the majority of employees do not want things to be exactly how they were pre-pandemic. So I think that's a really interesting starting point. So I guess let's just start with the big question. If you can sort this all out, then we'll be all off the webinar by about 10:15. But I guess the question, Aine and Rob, is like, what is the right approach for employees and companies when it comes to this kind of great return to work, acknowledging that, you know, okay, not everybody has been away from work, you know, particularly frontline people. How would you guys go considering about, you know, this return to work, and what data or what approach do you think will help employers, particularly people on this call, think about this return to work? So I'll throw that open to you guys. And the both of you won't talk because yeah, it's fine. I'll just fill in the gaps if you want, but I don't think that's what you'd be good.
I think Aine and I have taken offence, Michelle, that you said that we won't do this topic justice in an hour.
You're going to stand off before we even get started. Like,
Aine, over to you, I suppose.
Yeah, no problem. First of all, yeah, as you rightly point out, Michelle, we talk about a return to work, but I do think we have to acknowledge the multiple different situations that people have been in throughout the pandemic. For some, yes, it will be a return to work because they haven't been working. For some, it might be looking at a new workplace. For some, they have been working one of the most intense periods of their lives over the last, nearly 15, 16 months now. So I would suggest that maybe a starting point might be more in terms of a reevaluation of how we work and how we want to work going forward. And for me, the key is all about asking the right question. So if employers or leaders in organizations are thinking, well, how can we work and interact most effectively and most sustainably together with our who, and our who being our key stakeholders? Because there are the employees, but there's the customers, every company has investors and shareholders, the wider community that they work with, and also the environment. And then how do you do that in order to achieve your why? And if you have your why at the center of all of your decision making, and your why being why you exist, your purpose, why your organization does what it does, and then you're having that conversation with those key stakeholders and asking those questions, I think that's a very good place to start from, and it should give a very good report. And yes, we all learn by doing. There will be a constant, I think there will be a continuous learning opportunity, evaluation, what's working, adjusting. But I think you can really only start off by asking those questions. And it is something that Veolia has been asking. We were all set to go one way back in September, October. Then we had to take a step back again, ask some more questions again. And now and obviously I can only really speak to Veolia, but we are looking at that hybrid situation. But we are in a slightly different situation as well to other companies, because we have always had a distributed workforce. We provide essential services to other companies who are providing essential services. So we manage energy, water, and waste for companies who produce medicines, who produce food and drink, who provide frontline medical care in the hospitals. So our teams are a mix of people in offices supporting those staff, and then people directly on the sites. So that is always something that we have had to bear in mind. And as we go forward, it's asking those questions with our teams, because what works for the teams on the sites will obviously work in a different way for the teams who were traditionally in the offices.
I think that's really interesting, Aine, the fact that Veolia have always used that terminology, distributed workforce. And I think what people are struggling, to Michelle's question, around what data do we have to support decisions that we're likely to make, it's very thin, and it's in a very unusual context. And I think what you guys have done and the insights that you have are quite unique and highly relevant to this question. And I love the fact that you've asked about the quality of the question that we're asking to shape the decision. And when I think about this question, I have 3 buckets broadly, right? So workforce, workplace, and work patterns. That are real considerations we need to consider when we talk about work. And I know you've dipped into what you guys have done in Veolia, Aine, and what I'll do is, again, through running talent, somewhat we get unique access to kind of global thought leadership. And if I quoted, say, Michelle or one speaker, for example, I believe that's plagiarism, but I'll quote several, and that's research. So I can share my research from Talent Summit with you. But on that question, you mentioned Gallup, you mentioned Glassdoor, Michelle. Like, they're surveys of employers or of employees. And if we ask a question of our employees, would you like to work in a rigid, linear, stiff way, or would you like flexibility? It's the quality of the question will weight the answer, and I think if we reverse that question, I think it's a very obvious answer to that question if we ask employees, and we're right to, by the way, like the shift over the last 18 months has been from employee experience to that of human experience, and that human experience needs to be at the center of how we redesign work itself. Like, it has to be, and it needs to be in a sustainable way. So that's a given. But I liked what you said, Aine, around like understanding our stakeholders and understanding what's best for them. So I would ask the question, like, with the basis being that and trusting ourselves that we do the right thing for the human experience of our people, but what works best for our customers? Like, where our people work, who's working, and how they're working. How does that deliver best for our customer? That's the first question I think we need to ask. Then the second question, what does that mean for the business? 3, what does it mean for the team? And 4, the individual. So again, just to cascade and ask the question a different way would give us a very different sense. And if you're like me, like people in our business and there's some of this call perhaps, we've had people who've really kind of knocked it out of the park over the last 18 months, and they've worked really, really, really hard and done amazing things. And we've other folks who've possibly coasted. And I think looking at the skills, looking at the performance, looking at the people, and looking at the spectrum of views on this, is that some are better in the office and some are absolutely better working remote. So I think it's a mixed bag, and that spectrum of views you mentioned, Michelle, we spoke about this at Talent Summit, and on one hand we had Patagonia. I can't say it without a Dublin accent. Patagonia. We'd Patagonia. We'd Patagonia. It was the chief people officer, and they believe their tribe is better together. So really strong views, very like Netflix, very like Goldman Sachs. And the other end of that spectrum, we had Dropbox speak about their shift to virtual first work, and one of the first kind of pioneers in that space when the pandemic hit. But the most interesting balanced view I thought from that conference was actually a comment from, it was the chief people officer of Zoom, Lynn Oldham. So they've enabled all of this distributed remote working over the last 18 months. And she said, why on earth would you rush to commit to a location without testing it? Why don't we simply test it, see what works, and then look to build upon that using the data, the insights in real time? She said, you would not release a product without testing it. Why would we commit to the future of work without testing it?
Yeah, it makes complete sense, doesn't it? Because I think for most of us, we know that pre-pandemic, it wasn't like work was perfect either. So what's happened is we've put this abnormal focus where we're almost like looking for the perfect solution. But sure, the perfect solution doesn't exist, Rob, right? And you're right. It definitely takes a lot of tweaking, doesn't it, to get it to there or to whatever as good can look like, you know? And I was really interested, Rob, like particularly thinking about your link to Sigmar and just the awareness you have around that. But it kind of leads me on to like the kind of the second big trend we're starting to see in the data around this, Rob, which is I was looking at Microsoft released their Work Trends Index. I don't know if anybody's seen that yet. No. And it's a survey of about like 30,000 employees in 31 countries. And basically what they looked at was kind of the trends in employment, and about 40% of the people surveyed said they were considering leaving their employer in this year. And then I tried to find, like, you know, like good research, tried to find other data points, right, cross correlate. So then I looked at Prudential's Pulse of America, which I know is, okay, that's an American bit of research, but they were saying that about 25% of the US working population are looking at a new employer post-pandemic. So I think what we're starting to see is that there's this, I suppose that the pandemic has brought forward, to your point, oh, thank you, Claire. Rob, to your point, the pandemic has brought forward how we see how employers treat us, what the human experience is. And I kind of layer that on then, Rob, thinking about, like, it's not just employees, it's also candidates as well. Again, looked at some research LinkedIn did back in March. And what they were basically saying was that if they look at remote a year before, or even even in the months prior, there's about a 91% increase in the amount of jobs with the word remote or remote based or willing to be remote based. So I think what it's saying is that potentially is that not just employees, but also prospective employees want to work differently, may want more flexibility. Now, I don't necessarily attribute them saying people want to work only in remote, but I think, Rob, to your point, it's about flexibility. So it kind of that in mind, you know, what are the big considerations for working either hybrid or remote? Like, what are the challenges? What are the practical things to think about? What are the opportunities that sit within that, Rob? And I suppose maybe I might throw it, Rob, to you first, if you don't mind, just to correlate and go, God, am I off the mark with that research? Like, are you guys seeing that even yet? And because I think that's interesting for all of us as employers, we're all trying to manage talent. So yeah, I'll throw that to Rob first, if you don't mind.
Isn't it funny, like, for like every CEO on the planet, the biggest challenge was that of talent acquisition, retention, performance. It was the bottleneck to growth before the pandemic hit. That's where it was.
Yeah.
And then we went into wartime and everyone kind of knuckled down. And we've been through a storm. People have been on different boats throughout that storm. And how we've shown up as leaders or as employers over that period is really the measure of where we are today. It's the measure of where we are today. And two things will happen. We might have built immense trust and loyalty amongst our people. But my guess is that we've had an unnatural level of retention, and therefore we've got a kind of 18 months of attrition now on the horizon. And we've seen a huge amount of activity, both in candidate interest and also in demand in the marketplace this year to date. So we've seen three kind of conflating like macro themes. So consumer confidence has been pent up and built up over the last 18 months, which is a big dynamic in labor force growth. Business confidence has come back strong. There's been a Zoom boom across many sectors, but for broader sectors, it's come back very strong this year. And there's expected growth within GDP or in the economy. So those macro trends are all very positive. But to come back to the question around like what we need to consider as we figure out where we work. I think the biggest risk stroke opportunity for us as leaders within our organizations is that of equity. So equality amongst our distributed workforce. And let me just maybe give you, again, a bucket of three things to consider perhaps, Michelle. And so look, from a communication and knowledge sharing, like the dislocation of the workforce has been forced upon us. We know that. And now we've got choice, candidates, employees, employers have choice. And if we get it wrong, it comes at a risk, or it's not considered as we repatch this workforce back together. How we share knowledge and how we communicate would have a considerable impact. And if you're like me, Michelle, like again, before you go into a meeting or board meeting, like, do you remember the meeting before the meeting or the wash up after the board meeting?
That's the important part, right?
It's when decisions get made. Yeah, it's when you influence your peers. It's when like decisions get made. It's when we experience each other during those moments. All of that built into the fabric of our experience of work. And I think there's a risk here. And there's a risk of this proximity bias being a very, very real thing. We know the pandemics within the pandemic over the last 18 months around ethnicity, around race, around inclusion. There are very real challenges to so many organizations around the world, if not every organization. And I think we've got one more that we're blind to, which is this proximity bias. So those who are closer to management will build this managerial capital. And again, I'd love to get Aine's view on this in a second around what you've potentially seen, having had this distributed workforce and what it means for you guys. But we've, I suspect that those who are closer to influence will get recognition and get reward and get promotion. And there's a very material risk there if it's not considered, if it's not mapped, if it's not understood on an individual, a team, and an organizational level. And that needs a very different gear, a very different way of working. The second thing, collaboration and performance. Like the shift from employee experience to human experience. When I talk about human experience, Michelle, it's the sustainable well-being from a mental, a physical, and a kind of financial well-being. Like, how do we sustain what matters most to our people from a human perspective? And again, there's been a mixed kind of feeling, I think, where people have had this kind of virtual theism. It became a very real thing, didn't it, in France when laws were introduced. And again, a lot of people reversing back on policies that were introduced that intended to safeguard the well-being of people. But that virtual theism is a very real thing. And the patterns of work. So Aine, you mentioned at the beginning that you've got young kids. We're talking about songs, weren't we?
Yes.
We won't bore people, but we're talking beforehand. So you've got young kids. So like, and then say, Michelle, I know you work like late hours, and say I've got kids in school. So the patterns of what suits us best need to be understood at an individual level, and that we have a respect for the boundaries and the response time and all of these nuances when it comes to how we collaborate. And that needs to be stitched together, and it needs to be nearly like a local service level between us as a team. That's where it needs to start in terms of how we collaborate to avoid this virtual theism and this needs to always feel on that you have to respond at different hours of the day, whether it be kind of some of your colleagues on different sites, for example, on you. Now, finally, culture. How culture is experienced has been radically different. It's been radicalized over the last 18 months. And one of our speakers, a talent summit actually, Dara Sheridan, he's the manager of high performance sport in New Zealand, and he spoke about the All Blacks. And I know you know some of the guys on the team there as well. So Michelle, so I was surprised that they didn't have this big shiny kind of training place like their HQ. They travel around and train in these shitty grounds. They don't have a place. And for them, what I came to understand from that example is that culture and high performance culture amongst the All Blacks is not about place. It's about ideology. And if you think that true, and if you look at culture and the risk of when we kind of now return, if we have it in a hybrid kind of world, people experience us in our presence, both as leaders and as team members, and how they experience and feel us in our presence. I didn't say feel us in our presence, did I? How they experience us in our presence is how they interpret culture. It's an output. It's an experience, and in the absence of place, it has to be more about ideology. So the kind of point here is that we need to get better at storytelling of how our values show up for our people when they're needed most. How did our values show up for our people when they're needed most over the last 18 months? That is the way to express the values, which gives the behavior which is experienced as culture. And that comes down to storytelling, to get into someone's ear, into their mind, and to drop it into the heart, because that's where culture is experienced. So there are the three kind of main points I think we need to consider: communication and knowledge sharing, collaboration and performance, and how culture is experienced.
Interesting. And Aine, would you like, I'm really curious that you're like working in this world, and you guys probably were working in this obviously you were working this pre-pandemic. How would you say that has manifested, like, or what does that feel like for your organization and the people in it? Or Is there a point? Yeah.
I think there are a number of levels to respond to there. And if I go back to your original question of people starting to look at other roles, I think there's been a huge reevaluation, not just by organizations, but by people themselves. And I think for the first time, we're seeing an acknowledgement of the whole person and the multiple hats that they wear. And through the pandemic, people have been let into people's non-office or non-workplace personas, even just by the background that's surrounding them in virtual meetings. And that acknowledgement then is causing a reevaluation by the person, but also by the organizations. And it's like what you're saying, Robert, that consideration of workplace and where your boundaries actually sit. Previously, those boundaries would have been very formally defined in time, 9 to 5 for a lot of people, or obviously there's people who do shift work, other hours, and then in place, I enter the office door, I leave the office door, I put on my workplace hat, I take off my workplace hat and I put on 5, 10, however many other hats I might wear. Now there is a realignment and of those boundaries, a flexing of them throughout time and space. So it does very much come back to what you're saying, Robert, and I fully agree, and I've seen it in Veolia, that understanding of how we work together, how do we interact both formally in our meetings and informally to achieve what it is we need to do to fulfill our why or our business purpose. And I found it interesting what you were saying about the pre-meeting and the post-meeting and that importance of equity, because I would observe, and this might be unique to an organization like Veolia with a more distributed workforce, that for though previously you might have had a group in a boardroom who were having the meeting, maybe 5, 10 people in there, and then a number of other people dialing in from throughout various locations throughout the organization. Also for our multinational partners on the call today might recognize this. For the people who would have been dialing in, whether by phone or on the screen, there would have been that sense of inequity and the afterthought in the meeting. And of course, in those practical considerations now in the pandemic, on the understanding that everybody has access to the technology and to the systems, once you have that, I have seen a great leveler between, because everybody is the same size box in the virtual meeting and everybody has the opportunity to connect together and contribute. And I've seen a much better forming of working relationships through that experience of coming together. But we have done, I think, an awful lot of work and continuous reassessment of both our formal and our informal channels of communication, working, interaction. Our meetings, we must have tried about 55 different ways of setting time limits on meetings, how we work the agendas, then how do we allow for that connecting together before or after a meeting, maybe in some of our virtual conferences, setting up coffee and chat breakout rooms afterwards. We have seen some of our teams even just recording short videos on their phones. This is who we are, this is what we do, this is what we're proud of, and just circulating them amongst the company to try and replace those informal channels that we had before when people could get together around a coffee machine or could travel between sites that they no longer can do. So I do think it comes back to that question, how you work and interact sustainably and effectively together. And then that will lead you to the questions of, what is your workplace? What are your behaviors? What technologies do you need? That well-being piece as well. And that and most importantly, the interactions and how that manifests in your values and behaviors. So I would see a lot of what both of you were saying in Veolia.
Fascinating. I love everybody's the same size box. I think as someone who worked distributed for most of my life, and you get very used to almost trying to shout over the people that are in the room together, because there's like that natural dynamic, isn't there, that happens?
Yeah. And I have to say that would be one of my biggest, from wearing my communications hat in Veolia, that's my biggest concern for when we go forward. I don't want that feeling of inequity between different workplaces where the group are to sneak back in. And it's how do we manage that now going forward as well?
Really
is there a big risk though that we revert back to type on you, like a lot of companies really thought they were like ahead of the curve, you know what I mean, like we can dial our poor cousins in onto a big screen, we'll have the crack here, they can listen to the crack, like, you know what I mean, like there was this sense of like distributed friendly, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or remote friendly, you know what I mean? Like where everything, and I think it's being deeply considered by some companies. And again, I think it's starting to come true. Like a lot of what makes these places unique, and they've built it upon their unique culture and the experiences of their people, of each other every day, is so different. And although they've really made a huge effort and deeply considered this kind of linear working style, and like to avoid all of these things that we're talking about, the experience is still different. And when it comes to like, say, retention or like decisions for people to move, what I've come to understand in recent weeks, both internally and amongst, say, our clients and stuff like that, is the decision. People have asked big life questions of themselves, haven't they, in the last 18 months?
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's been really, it's forced us to think differently and what we value. And you mentioned why several times throughout your answers, Aine, and it's important. But the experience of the move, if you think it through, like there's still likely to be working remote and onboarded remote. And it's not a big shift. It's not a big change. There's no fear factor of a move now, you know? And I think the dynamics of what motivates somebody to leave or what attracts them to an opportunity has all changed. We're in a very different kind of working world, and competitive advantage now for employers is very different. And in many ways, it is their COVID story. So again, how they showed up, how the values showed up, and what values have been stressed, and how have people really reconsidered what they are, what they stand for as an organization. Because like, Michelle, you're in the well-being, engagement, performance space. Like, has every company not become a healthcare business to some degree? Or has it not become one of our main values, like in every organization, but no one's actually saying that or talking about that? And
I think, Rob, like, you know, what interests me the most is that I see such a stark difference with clients, right? And not just clients or prospective clients. I see the ones that are really, they get it. They see intrinsically that actually, to your point, the human experience needs to be different, right? To Cleana's point, people are whole people. They don't come to the door and change, right? And I see others that are just like, tick the box, let's do a talk here or there. But actually, it is, to your point about behavioral change, right? It is about how do we actually embed this into how we work day to day, which is de facto our culture. And I think what interests me is like coming from the kind of companies that I've worked for, the big high-end fancy pants tech companies. Like if suddenly I'm not having a 5-star lunch and a free massage and a slide from the 3rd floor to the 1st floor, actually what it brings us back to is arguably what it should have always been about, Rob, right? Which is the quality of the work I'm doing and the quality of the work the people I work with, right? And the interesting thing is, I think that there's a huge play for employers as well, that we don't have to all compete with the Twitters and the Googles and the whatever, that there is more, you know, the important things in work, we're always doing important things, it's just we got distracted by stuff, right? So I'm kind of, I guess my one fear, if I be honest, Rob, is that, as me being a bit vulnerable here, is that employers will go through, as human beings, will go through COVID and we'll come out the other end and we'll just kind of normalize and go back, and we won't take the learnings, because this is like the great awakening, right, of what actually always mattered in work. And I think it kind of brings me forward, Cleana and Rob, to like that idea of like, we've talked a lot about this kind of like what the future might look like. So we've talked about people want something different, companies want something different. We've got this big war, an even bigger war on talent than we've ever had, or a bigger focus on talent, or we will have. And we've talked about the differences that are required to operate in this new norm. Like, Cleana, we're all boxes now on a screen or whatever we'll be in the future. But like, I guess that obviously requires a different skill set, both for us as employees, as well as us from a leadership perspective. And I guess if we start maybe first with the leadership piece, because I know a lot of people on the call are senior leaders responsible for big organizations or for organizations of all sizes. But like, what are, like we've talked in the past, Rob, you and I have talked a lot about this human-centered leadership. But like, what are the implications for like leadership styles and behaviors? Like, what kind of leaders will be most successful in the new world of work? What should we be thinking about there?
Yeah, again, Aine mentioned the boxes. So again, if I'm to answer your question like as simply as I can, look at the screen we're looking at right now, right? So I can see myself, Cliona, Aine, you, and Leah blacked out. So if you look at the individual human capital, so you imagine this is our organization, okay? Yeah. And each of us is a human capital, a block within the organization. Yeah. And as Aine said, this is balanced, it's equal, we're all the same size. If you look at the black line that joins us, the cement, that cement is really important. And if you think what we've been through, like all of our organizations have distributed. So if the analogy is a wall or a building for our organization, and each individual is a block within that wall, we've been scattered far and wide, haven't we? Yeah. And at what cost? It's the cost of that black cement. So that black cement is in many ways invisible. And that black cement is social capital. It's what happens between us. And when the chips are down, what happens between us, those experiences, those friendships, those bonds, that trust, that's what matters most. And that's been broken. So as leaders, the biggest thing we need to focus on as we reconvene is what ingredients go into that cement. How do we reconfigure social capital in a hybrid world? And that's a very unique skill set for leadership, I believe. I think there's skills around servant leadership. There are skills around like connected leadership. Like how do we connect? And how do we do that from a starting point of caring? And this is more human than leadership. Like this is just like about decency. It's about, yeah, just giving a shit. Like really caring about your people. There was one story, if I may just share with you, from Talent Summit. I don't know if you know this business. Only do you know them? Qualtrics. It's like a survey business out of Utah. So they set up. Ryan Smith, the CEO and the founder, was speaking, and he was talking about his journey. He received an award. The award was in the name of Dermot Costello, who was his first employee in Europe who passed away. And he worked here. He set the operation up in Dublin. So they built this, again, very successful business. They sold it to SAP for 18 billion, the highest software valuation of any private sale up to that point. And then they subsequently floated off and they got like a 22 million valuation. He bought the Utah Jazz, a very successful guy. And he recalled one story, and it was a story of him setting up. He said, people look at the success of the business now. They don't remember a scared young CEO making the biggest decision of his career at that time, which was to open his second office. He says, to do something out of what I knew and what I grew up in was so alien to me. He says, we went to Dublin. That was as far as you can imagine, like from my world in Utah. When I got there and when we hired our first employee, who was Dermot, he said, I just don't remember interviewing Dermot, but I remember what I felt when I met Dermot. And he said, what it felt like was this arm around me, somebody who saw my vulnerability. And the sense I had was that I've got you, kid. I've got you, kid. And he said, that made me think very deeply about how we support our people. And he said, I felt that Dermot was all in on me. He was all in on the company. And we had to be all in on him. So truly, if we can create that sense of having an arm around our people, that we've got them and we're all in on them, I think that's a very powerful human stroke leadership quality. And if we can do that or come from that point and reconsider the social capital, the ingredients that we need in our cement is a key skill as we reconvene.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to build on that. When you talk about the social ingredients and the capital, I really see that in the fact that each person in an organization is with that organization because they see a value in that organization and that organization sees a value in them. And it's important then that both parties have that shared, clear picture and understanding of what that value is, and then work out together how that can best be maximized within the team of other people bringing value to the organization in order, once again, and going back to the company's purpose, but that has to be the beacon by which you look at and by which you evaluate yourselves. Because once you know your purpose and you know the performance areas against which you evaluate yourself for your key stakeholder groups, you have that clear shared picture of where each talent or value or person brings into that piece, then it becomes very easy to map out your route and to identify your skill sets that you'll need both from an employee and a leader or employer perspective. And I saw a number of kind of comments flashing up there as you're talking, Robert, about talent and trust. And I think if you're focusing on the performance areas, again, and that shared picture and clarity of value towards purpose, the trust just becomes, it's a given, because you're focused on what's important to helping the company and the team succeed together. And for me, a key skill for leaders within that is coming back to what we said at the start. It's asking the right question, and then it's listening to the answers, and then it's knowing how to help co-design and co-create that and involve your teams in bringing that to the fore to maximize what it is that you need to do to create that shared picture and to make it clearer and work together. Yeah. I think then, sorry, Michelle.
I was going to ask you, you know, if you think about like previously, a lot of say middle management was like almost like the distribution, checking in on work. It was quite transactional work. Do you think that in this new world of work that there might either be less of those managers, or their shift would need to be into more like coaching and facilitation and removing blockers? What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's a key skill for any manager. A manager is, for me, their role in whatever level they're at within an organization is to get the best out of their team as a team together. And in order to do that, you understand the value, you understand how the team can best work together to achieve that. So it has to be, it's about allowing that to flourish, enabling that value to come through, removing those blockers, and at whatever level you might set it. There's always those. I think that's the key function for me in any case.
And even on that, Anya, like again, I don't know, Michelle was telling us she's like an international athlete at the very beginning, and to pinch an analogy from your world,
he looks Michelle, like he at an international.
No. I know the level you've performed at, and I know some of those stories, but it's person first, player second. Isn't that ultimately what we're saying? You know, like to pinch something from your world. But if I overlay like the coaching for sure, and again that human experience piece from a leadership perspective, but like I think awareness is really important for leaders right now. And if you look at the mix of the workforce, remote, hybrid, and in office, and I spoke about this managerial capital and this proximity bias, if we are deeply aware of that, like how do we recognize quiet success? How do we recognize remote performance? And how do we make sure that that's part of our decision making? And let me just touch on decision making. This is really important. Again, I'm just reminded of a story. You know, Margaret Heffernan, Michelle. So a TED speaker, again an author and a thought leader on all things leadership and work. She spoke, and if the problem here is a problem or a potential problem or risk of equality, if it's about equity, what's the antidote to equality or equity? It's really to have a just culture, to have a culture that is just. Doesn't that make sense? So if it's about equality and it being just. So she gave the example. So she lived in the US and she's from the UK. And she wrote in her book, her recent book, it's called Uncharted, amazing book. And she cited the example of the Irish Citizens Assembly. So I didn't know the full detail of this, honestly, right? But when I read the book, it became clear. I was reminded of it. So when we, as a country, were trying to bypass the political impasse around abortion, such a thorny subject, what was decided upon was to bring 100 citizens together, those who would be impacted most around these types of decisions, and for them to come up with a recommendation to the government of the day. And that process, that yielded a recommendation that ultimately became legislation, which was to legalize abortion. And the process upon which that decision was arrived it bypassed a long-standing political impasse. So just think that through. It wasn't the decision. So what happened was, it was the process through which the decision was arrived. It gave the decision legitimacy. And those who disagreed with it did not disagree with the process. Their belief system was different and they disagreed with the decision, but they made peace with it. So I think there's a learning in that for us as leaders, as we're trying to figure out and as we're trying to get awareness of where our people are and their impact in the business and decisions that we make as leaders from this point, that the process through which we crowdsource opinion, we listen, as you say, Aine, and ask the right questions in order to get the right answers. But it's the process through which we arrive at the decision that will give us legitimacy as leaders and also create a just culture. And I think that's a really positive step forward.
Love it. I love that, Rob. Powerful stuff. I've just kind of encouraged, if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the chat. I know, Ross, you were kind of chatting about the challenges with distributed and asking a question to the panel of, can we address the issue of how to promote talent in your business in a blended future environment? So I think that actually builds nicely, doesn't it, on what Aine and Rob, we've been just chatting about, particularly that last question. And I know we've talked as well when we were prepping a lot about like outputs over inputs. Yes. I'll throw that out to you guys. How would you guys think, even in your own business, how would you guys think about the promotion of talent? What do you think would be important to consider?
Well, unsurprisingly, I'm going to come back to the purpose of the organization, your key stakeholder groups, and the performance areas that you agree as an organization against those. If you are looking at your talent, and how you're going to look at them, I would be suggesting that you need to look at the whole area and how you're performing against each of those areas and the skills then that are going to be needed. And that piece then, or maybe it's around facilitation, around coaching, about how you develop that interacting together piece to, I suppose, build up that skills and build up that succession planning against all of your key performance areas. But if you're looking objectively, and I think that echoes what Robert was saying earlier, you need to take that objective whole of organization and whole of person look so that you can assess, as you say, Michelle, outputs rather than personalities.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand, Aine, isn't it, what we're asking of people if we are promoting them, and how is that sustained? And like as I say, some people over the last 18 months or so, like, I don't think their work rate is sustainable, quite frankly. No. You know what I mean? And are we doing them a service or a disservice through asking more of them? And like, have we been absent leaders? And have we allowed this virtual theism where there's constant need to be on and constant need, like, if people are kind of, if home has become work, you know what I mean? No boundaries, as you say, Aine, like, it's not sustainable. So I think we need to be considered, we need to be all in from a HX perspective, a human experience perspective, but not to be afraid to recognize performance, not to be afraid to recognize that achievement, but not to expect it to the same level, perhaps, if it's not sustainable in the long run. And
I think you're right. I think is it a case of more or is it a case of different? And like that, will that piece about, I think, self-regulation and self-awareness is going to be such an important skill for leaders and for employees going forward, because with those boundaries no longer being formally defined in time and place, each person with themselves and then within their wider team needs to understand where the boundaries are and how they are defined from them, and when those boundaries are starting to be maybe flexed a little bit more than they should be in order to operate sustainably. Yeah, but I think that's something that you have to do as an individual and then with the team in order to work out what's best.
100%. And I think, like, it's funny, like, I'd also just add one small note of, like, on what basis are we promoting our people? And if I look at the skills, again, we've measured this. So the skills needed for remote work, we've come to understand them, haven't we? You know, so it's about, like, initiative, digital communication, adaptability. Like, we know them now. So we've experienced them. We know what they are. Hybrid work, you guys, I suspect, may have a good sense of this. But for hybrid work, in some organizations, for the individual contributor, it's really about influencing. And it's about proactive communication. It's around self and situational awareness and understanding that if they're, say, 2 days in the office, or if they get FaceTime like on a less frequent basis, that they use that. And that creates a bit of a political savviness, is my sense. And those who shout louder sometimes get the recognition. So we as leaders need to be conscious not to lean into this managerial capital that some people have gained, and to promote people on that basis. That it's not about the visibility, it's really about the output, as you said at the top of it, Michelle.
Mm-hmm. Because when you think about it, so much of how we measure employees is input basis, right? Like my involvement in things, the hours I'm here, whatever it is. And actually in a hybrid world, does that matter so much? No, all that matters is the quality, the result, well, I'm not saying just the result, obviously, is the how you get there too.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is potentially as well from a future talent perspective as well, is it actually gets us focused on what leaders always should have been, because we've had so many leaders in the past promoted because of, technical expertise, length of role in service, political favoring, or just, no offense, but like proximity bias, that kind of stuff. And actually, I think it's going to force us to look at some really tough kind of decisions or questions around leaders as well, or managers, like what is their role and who will genuinely do the best job at it, because I think there's a lot of that to still be found out.
I don't agree. We should look too closely. I'd hate to be demoted, Michelle. Like, that would be really kill me.
Okay, I'll talk to AD later. It's okay.
But that is actually an interesting point you raised, Michelle, when you talk about virtual team. I actually think that's a red flag. If you see that somebody is working and constantly there, that to me says that that's not sustainable. They are not managing. They don't have those self-regulation skills that maybe they do, and maybe that's where extra supports are needed.
No, though, I'm not so sure about that, if I be honest, because I think that people work in an environment, right? And there's more than just, yes, ultimately we're all responsible for controlling our environment, but like, I think it also depends on the environment you work in.
True.
The people you work with. And I only just say that to try to be balanced, is that I think that, if you, no offense, but like I've worked for enough crappy managers to know that when they keep dumping stuff on me and you're just trying to shovel your way out, sometimes I've got to work differently. So I don't disagree with the concept though, what you're saying, Anya. I think that all things are not always linear. And I suppose that's our job, isn't it, as leaders, is to, I think like for me, I think that's one of the biggest skills of the future leaders, right? Is that ability to get amongst something and to really understand potentially what is to help. Was it Einstein? You guys will have to keep me honest on this. Was it, he said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 50 minutes figuring out what the right question to ask was. And I think that's one of the many important skills for the leaders, or people, or not even just leaders, because anybody in an organization can or should be a leader, but like figuring out what are we actually talking about, what's the actual problem we're trying to solve. And I think what's interesting for leaders is like, we have to really get amongst stuff now. We can't do that just helicopter, I'll come into a meeting, make a decision, I'll go. It's actually, we've got to get amongst stuff and really understand it. And I think for me has been actually, probably as a leader, one of the most exciting parts of COVID is it's got me far more connected back to things. So I think that has only benefited from us on a business perspective anyway. Conscious we have about 4 minutes left. I know we talked about a couple of takeaways, guys, but before we kind of get into that, is there any final questions or reflections, or Cliona, is there anything that you would like us to address before we move off?
No, I think I'm just looking at any questions that come. I think we covered all the points on that. Thanks.
No problem. So just, I suppose we tried to, as a panel, pull together a couple of what we thought were the pertinent takeaways for people kind of considering the new world of work and what to think about. And I think, Rob, I suppose I'll speak to one of the points you made about the Chief People Officer of Zoom, which was our kind of first takeaway was, you don't actually have to decide anything straight away, but you really should start to gather data and consider options and what they mean on all levels. You talked, Rob, about customer, you talked about organization as a whole and the employees in it. I think the second takeaway we had was that there isn't really a right or a wrong approach, that there's only whatever approach you choose for your company. And I think, Aine, you spoke to that beautifully when you talked about what worked for Veolia, and that might not necessarily work for another organization, but it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. And I think our thoughts on that was like, just don't be tempted to do what everybody else is doing. All approaches have pros and cons, and everything potentially requires changes in, Rob, what you said, like the how we work. And then I think the third part we kind of talked about, very practical on the takeaway side, was like, set up some kind of working group, but it needs to be a group of people who have some level of authority to actually affect change, in order to kind of understand, like, what are the tools, what are the practices, what are the policies, what are the behaviors, what's the storytelling that we need in order to really effectively work. And then, Rob, probably coming back again to your first point there, but like, don't be afraid to try or to trial things. Not everything needs to be global. Not everything needs to be forever. To your point, Rob, we could have a go and like iterate as we go. And that's actually really great. I think the one interesting thing from a culture perspective is that's so positive from a mindset point of view with our employees. We have to get more human, and we have to be able to say to people, we're leaders, we're not perfect, we don't know all the answers. We're going to give it a go, and we'll all be grown up enough that if it doesn't work, we'll change. Not this idea of like, we're rolling out it globally and that's it, it's done. And then I think finally, Rob and Aine, I think the both of you have hit on this continuously through all your responses, was to really think human first. Companies, I mean, effectively companies don't exist, right? All that exists are the people within them. I mean, we know they exist in terms of the legal entity. So it's really like, if companies are just collectives of people, then the work environment that we talked about should allow them to do their very best work. So we have to kind of stop managing. We have to use this COVID opportunity, which, you know, I know, Rob, you've talked a lot about turning crisis into opportunity. And it definitely has been a crisis, we know that, but not kind of doing that old school, like, let's manage to the lowest common denominator, but like, let's use COVID as a springboard to like a more human-centric workplace. So as much as it's big and it's scary for everyone. And as I talked to my Twitter colleagues during the week, and they were like, yeah, Jack said remote first, but you know, God, we're going to have to not backpedal, but we're going to have to get more realistic about how to implement that. We know it's scary. We know there's a lot of stuff ahead of us, but there really is a great opportunity in it. So yeah, with that, Cliona, I'll hand back to you. Bang on time. Rob is...
Well done, Michelle. I see we did have one last question, but from Seamus Hunt. So Seamus, I will forward the question to the group and try and get back to you via email, because we're running out of time. So thank you very much for this extremely interesting and, I have to say, thought-provoking conversation this morning. It's so timely, and we're getting a lot of comments from our participants saying that they did find it just opening up new ideas. They have gone away with some new ideas. So thank you very much, Michelle, Aine and Robert, for joining us today. Really appreciate it, and we do hope we will talk to you sometime soon again on this topic. It's such a complex one. And also thank you to Leah, who's hiding in the background, who did all the work and the technical work to set this up. And finally, to all our participants who joined us today, we have this recorded. We will send you the link, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next events very soon. So thank you. Have a lovely day. Bonne journée avec le soleil brille. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt. See you soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.